This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is the first Sunday of February, February the 4th, 2018, and you're tuned to WEFT. This is the Prairie Monk, WEFT's weekly look at, I always say this when it's snowy outside, you'd call them greenways, but of course it's also snowy out there right now, and conservation is always going on, whether it's snowy outside or the middle of July.
Yeah, you might have noticed as we broadcast that my breathing occurs. So I've been doing a little research on this, and Mike Feldman has been helping me out. He runs the WEF sessions on Monday night, where he has to have mics to adjust to people's speech and to loud drums and a whole bunch of different mics, and he's advised us to speak across the microphone so that the breath part of one's singing, for instance, doesn't confuse the system. So just a minor part of what we do is we have to know about the technology.
I've heard that professionals who spend a lot of time talking where other people will hear them, like on the air, learn to breathe in as quickly as possible. So they take really fast breaths in. So if you listen to the weather people, for example, on the news, or even senators, whatever, Congress people who are interviewed a lot, you'll hear them. The way that they breathe in is different from the way we, you take long breaths.
Yes.
So not that but on the other hand, we're community radio. We're just folks from the community. No one, I think, expects us, almost expect us to be like a normal person sometimes.
Jason had another side to it, that people don't know how to use microphones. Mm-hmm. And they tend to be 2 feet away from them when you need to eat them. And so in order to do that, sometimes the engineer will turn the sound up in order to get them from a distance. And that means that if you are used to doing it close to the microphone, then you get to be very loud.
Whenever I train people on how to run the board here, I always tell them, if you can manage it, if you ever have a guest, get them to wear headphones. Because the thing is, people don't realize how they sound on the air. So the sound that your breath makes when you take a long breath in, chewing gum. I have had to stop a couple of people from chewing gum on the air. You don't realize how loud that is when it's, like imagine putting your ear 2 inches away from somebody's mouth. Mm-hmm. Every sound that you can hear there with your ear goes into the microphone. And I'm going to stop talking about this now, because unless people, we've just had air shifter training, but be sure and stay tuned, because we'll be doing it again within a few months. We'll have a spring pledge drive coming up, and we always have a air shifter training after that. We would love to have you folks out there joining us. The only way we can be really good representation of our community is for folks like you to be here on the air representing our community. And now I really am going to stop. Hey, Dave, what do you have to talk about today?
Okay, well, I still have a little bit more to say. I go to quite a few of meetings where there's questions and answers after, and it's tremendously helpful to have a microphone that goes around the crowd. There are always people who feel that their voice is loud enough and crisp enough that it can be heard by 60 people in a room, and it's not the case. You need to have that microphone, and it takes a little while to get to you. So you don't spread your question before you've got the microphone. It requires a little bit of pizzazz on the part of the people who are making the questions and answering them. Sometimes you have to have sympathy, because people are coming to this sort of situation naive. I go to railroad seminars, and they have an engineer that works with this. They have lavaliers on the speaker. They put out a PowerPoint pictures of the graphs and charts and that other people across the country need, and then they videotape it the same way as we're videotaping now, and that gets to be available. And they also stream on radio. So one way or another, one seminar in Champaign gets to be heard or understood across the country and probably across the world. So that requires some people who are like David, engineers, and know the computerization behind it. And we are very appreciative of that. So, having said that, I'll launch on to today's program. I have a lot to say. I don't know whether I'll get through it all. We've been trying to introduce you to a range of things that you might get involved with if you're concerned with natural history. We have been talking about the Department of Natural Resources, the Nature Preserves Commission, which is a subunit of the Department of Natural Resources. We've been talking about the divisions of, ecological divisions of Illinois. There's about 14, ranging from the north, which is getting into cold climates, to the south, which gets you into Pole Cypress and more or less the Gulf state extensions. We've talked about trusts and their involvement, and then this week we want to deal with one of those trusts that was in town this week. It is the Vital Lands Trust, and Vital Lands has over the years decided that it would like to support people to work with natural areas. There's a subsidiary company or associated company called the Grand Victoria Foundation, and they are oriented to encouraging people to know how to go about things. That might mean that they provide funding for, in an emergency, for the acquisition of land, or it might be encouraging stewards. It might be working at the political level to change a regulation like tax exemption for natural areas. They're looking at building public awareness, and some of their objectives are very much long-term. It may be that a park in a park district might have a short life, but they might extend it by qualifying it and working with groups like the Nature Preserves Commission. They must have had best part of 100 people at the summit, and there were various speeches encouraging a real range of people that are there. Then they break into small think tanks where people, 10 or 15 people, are begged to decide what should happen to Vital Lands in the ensuing years. They have one of these summits once every year, and the aim is to extract comments from the citizens that are in these small groups. That means there needs to be leaders. And some of these leaders have been at this for many, many years. Some of them are quite young, recent graduates who are committing their lives to this sort of thing. They're beginning to realize that the next generations that come will not have the same resources that their grandparents had, and so on ad infinitum. It's getting less and less, and there's more and more people. So what things do you look at? Well, first of all, there's a look at the administration of this. Who do you want to have in your secretarial office? What do they do? Or what sort of skills do they have to have? What sort of activities are they going to support? If you need people to be young and active and pick up the microphone and run it to people, and add comments when people are uncertain to say something themselves, I get the impression that Vital Lands realizes that many of us have an overall objective, but we don't quite know how to go about it. We're not certain of the details. We may have been working at it for years, but we need to get together. And one of the themes with a breakaway session that I was at was that we need to get people together as individuals. It's okay to get you together on the internet and on cell phones, but somehow you need to be in the room together. Sometimes you have to deal with people who are picking up on what you're doing, but they have a very limited knowledge of what it is. So they may stress one aspect, and it may be disadvantageous when it's not realized. I felt that with the Pepsin factory in Monticello. I felt that this was a historic monster that was part of the history of the economic development of the area. And I felt that the public was gradually being educated that this was a non-functional grayfield building which used to house 250 or 300 people. It was an eyesore because it was a little on the decrepit side, but for those that knew at that same time across the country, there were many of these grayfields being closed out, and we needed an expertise. We needed the architect or the engineer or the public relations, the political strength to make these box factories viable again. And I felt that just bringing in one consultant or two consultants was not enough. So this is what Grand Victoria is about, is bringing people into the same room at the same time. You can do that some by having a connection between the East Coast and the West Coast and in between. But it's not quite the same as having people in the same room together. It's getting costly to fly to a meeting. Sometimes the meetings are held in Colorado or in Illinois just because you can come in from out of state. If you're in Hawaii, it's a genuine trip to come to O'Hare and to a meeting. So there are limitations, but especially at the local level, getting people together face to face is rather important because they listen to each other and they come up with ideas. So if you're looking at the administration of Vital Lands, you're looking at leaders who are trained to extract information from people. Then you also need those same people to find examples. Is there a natural area that has gone through the process of accreditation and made it? We have one situation in northwestern Illinois in Daviess County where sort of partially by happenstance they started to take over a small area, and then it ran to a lot of people being involved. So do we have an example, and do those leaders know that, and can they drop that idea without dominating the people that are bringing their information to the Vital Lands? It's always difficult when you have experts, so inverted commas, that come in and can more or less do the make decisions. So Vital Lands is looking at that in a nice fashion. So administration is important. What sort of support people we have out in the field is another one. There are technological innovations that might help. So one group was looking at drones and how drones can be used to examine a natural area. It might be that it's been fired or it is on fire, and you can't get anyone in there anyway. So a drone can help. It might be that you're just trying to count the number of elm trees or sycamores or what have you along a drainage ditch, and the reflectance from the leaves can be picked up by cameras. And so drones are effective. They can also help to document things. So Vince was there. Vince I've known, I've forgotten his second name, but he has been running around with a blunderbuss video camera for years, taking photographs of people's natural areas so that you could take a field trip on these natural areas. You could even take it on your cell phone, and as you get to one point in winter, what does it look like in summer? And so he will be using drones. So there's one of the questions was for these people was, what are you going to do when you go home? What are you going to encourage? There was one black lady there, one out of probably 100, and she was going to go home and do certain things with what she had been doing with her group, and that might even be getting people together in the same room and with the aid of an expert. And she seemed to be an expert in her own right. So I am very encouraged by that sort of meeting where people get together who don't always know what the objectives are, but have a rough idea of where they want to go. Is it a legal meeting? Do you want to have legal people who can stress the points that you don't always realize? Sometimes in the sort of meeting that I'm suggesting is you're often talking in a very friendly manner, but if that's in a legal office, that means that you're paying a huge amount for the discussion, which might be a very low-level discussion, but that's what you want. So how do we involve the legal people? There are people who have specific objectives, and I'm mean enough to be in that category. I would like this sort of group to know that we're about to put a trail on 30 miles of land between Bloomington and Farmer City and Mansfield, and that I don't want that trail to be so wide that it takes out all the natural area on either side. And alongside the roadsides where people get to see Prairie. So let me look at my docket again here. So let's leave the vital lands, but leave them with encouragement. And I was just pleased to see people there, to meet people, and to see them into action. That's one group. There might be other groups. The Nature Conservancy, the Land Alliances, various. I have a list of them in Illinois, and it might be around 30 people, so 30 groups. So we're just talking about one group, but it's an essential group. So the next thing I wanted to report on was BNSF. I went to a railroad seminar. I go to railroad seminars fairly regularly because the only natural area for prairie in Illinois is mostly along railroad lines. And I have to be able to talk the language of railroaders. That's not a derogatory thing. That's finding out how you put a number or a name on a certain process. And the speaker was from the BNSF railroad. BNSF railroad is a relatively recent railroad. It's a combination of Burlington Northern and Santa Fe Railroad. These railroads have been known over the years. I can remember when I first came here, I was familiar with railroad songs, and often the Santa Fe was mentioned in songs, and so was the Wabash. And to stand on a railroad line and hear those songs takes you back to how they went in and what happened over the years and how they have merged and moved apart from each other. There are a lot of little railroad lines, but they connect to major big lines. And one of the biggest is BNSF. And we need to talk to railroad people because unfortunately they own some of the only natural history that we have. It's often 100 feet wide, sometimes 200 feet wide, sometimes only 69 feet wide. It's but across the country, the railroading industry is running on relatively undisturbed soils and native vegetation and habitats. So I listened, and just as a lot of people were listening at the Vital Lands Conference, people listened. And this was a young fellow speaking. He'd gained his early activities in Champaign-Urbana, and his topic was a logistic park in Chicago. The logistics is where you take a railroad company that is taking containers from Los Angeles to Chicago, from New York to Chicago, from across country. A lot of these major lines are in the Midwest. They handle coal and they handle grain, and the company is more or less owned by Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett is very heavy in there. We have to be able to gently encourage railroaders to think of their right-of-way as more than just a right-of-way for rails. Not easy. Sometimes it's a matter of if you're wanting to have your Wi-Fi on the engine end of a train and you want to let somebody 1 mile away know what's happening with one vehicle or what are the statistics, and there's a tree in the way, the tree will go. So when the line is changed, there's a realization that the natural area on either side should be reconstructed. So that's in there with engineering. And there's there are usually groups of individuals that are leaders in the unions that are behind the railroading. One of them is where you have railroads associated with roads. There is an ASTO, AASHTO, Association of American Highway Engineers and Transportation Engineers. And that has a lot to say with what we do with these sites. Some of them are very rare. If you're in the Midwest, you don't have any other source of natural history because everything, the soils are so rich that everything else is corn and soybeans. If you're in the Ozark Hills, you might have a small line that can be wide because there's a lot of area on either side that is not in agriculture. Same with mining areas in the Appalachians. You can even decapitate a whole hill, and there's still a lot of vegetation around. So what was the seminar about? It was about a huge area, 2,500 acres in the Joliet area. And let me explain that when the Japanese invaded Hawaii, the country didn't have a lot of explosives on hand. So it basically went southwest of Chicago to the Joliet area, about 40 miles south of Chicago, and created an investment for producing armaments. And they had about 160 miles of railroad there and little bunkers every so often where the things were stored. That continued till the late 1900s, and then was disbanded. Part of it went to the natural history people as the Midday-one Prairie that is being restored. Some of this farmland was the 18 farms that were taken over to create the 2,500 acres that BNSF is using, plus the areas that the natural history people are using. Plus there's a Lincoln Cemetery there that is preserved, and there's probably some area for the disposal of trash. So this big area has been divvied up. Most of the railroad lines have been removed, but in there, the BNSF has trackage where you can bring in many trains that are up to a mile long, and so they have railroad beds that can be loaded and unloaded, and they have gantry cranes that can move across from one train to another, or they can take shipping containers off an intermodal train. An intermodal train is a train that never disconvolvulates. You don't put it together piece by piece. You put shipping crates onto it. So at the smaller level, you have a gantry crane that can cover a couple of trains, and it's on rubber tires, so it can move along the train, pick things off, take them horizontally across to a new train, or drop them onto a semi-trailer. The next step up is to have a larger crane that can stack these containers up so they don't take a lot of room. And then the next step up is to have a huge gantry crane that can probably move across 10 railroad lines and transfer containers from one train to another. This area is being developed at the moment. It is huge. It connects with another huge set of assembly yards that the Norfolk Union Pacific has, and in and around there are huge warehouses where some of the materials that are coming in and out can be utilized. So you have a range of things here. The engineering associated with this had to be on land that had a big drainage ditch in it. So you can't put a crane that weighs 55 tons on top of a wetland. So you have to deal with what the basis is. And then the bigger cranes are produced in Europe, where I suspect they have more use of railroads and have developed a system there. So some of the beams and framework of this new type of cantilevered gantry crane are produced. A gantry crane means that it is a crane that can lift a shipping container, often with the use of electricity, a magnet, lift it and move it across to another train. It's designed to do things quickly so that the trains can move in and out and on their way. So gradually, the engineer's responsibility is to put in the electricity, to create a railroad track that is heavy duty enough that, and with an accuracy of between one track and the other track, which might be 30 feet, of an accuracy of a few parts of an inch. There's 6 of these giant cranes, and they can move along this track. So the track has to be very heavy in its ballast. So you're on glacial till, and that is a very soft material. So how do you go down? Do you have to go down till you meet up with what was here before there was glaciation? So you may have a rock that is granite, or if it's igneous, or sedimentary rock, but it's stable. So you have to pile drive to get to that level. You have to then have often pedestals to support lamp posts and the like, so that they don't fall over in glacial till. So that means you may have a pedestal that's 6 feet across and up to 60 feet down. This is long-term stuff. This is not going to fall apart in 2 minutes. So all these things are important. They have cameras everywhere, so that there's a safety concern. And it may be in the future that all 6 cranes can be worked independently from a central source. But as of the moment, each crane is controlled by a crane driver who's an expert in these sorts of things. In order to put all this up, they have to have a different sort of crane, which is a crane sitting on the ground and lifting a beam up. That's not a gantry crane, but what they're producing is a gantry crane. So I was tempted to take a photograph of this person giving the seminar, because I need to let you folk know that there's a relationship between nature and the development. So we'll probably put a few pictures up of the center. It's 250 acres, 40 miles from Chicago. Originally, that was the reasoning behind that, was that you didn't want to have a center for TNT blowing up Chicago. And you need to have people, so you need to have a railroad line there to get people there to work it. You had to be careful that you didn't have electricity build up, so you would have earthing bars every so often, so people didn't set fire to things. So now that's obsolete, and it's going back to this. The undertaking is probably about a 600-acre multimodal facility, and I was very glad to be there. We have in our area railroads, and these intermodal trains go between centers. They might be in Chicago, usually about 300 miles apart. So the next one for us is Memphis. So you will have to have areas like in Champaign where you can pass one train that's 1 mile long with another. But on the other end of this, we have a wonderful Monticello Railroad Museum. And we also have an Allerton Park. And we have a Sangamon River. And although we are in the center of East Central Illinois, where things are flat and rich, so there's not a lot left, there is an attempt to put the Sangamon River back together so that we have a public corridor so that you can canoe. You can go from Mahomet to Allerton Park, and it takes you about 8 hours to do that. You have to know that you're on public waterway, and you're passing private land. There's all sorts of laws associated with this. But the growing population needs to know about railroads. And working with a historic railroad museum where at the moment re-railing between Whiteheath and Seymour, there's a lot of things that go on, and some of them are quite fun to do. You have an overall objective of getting a historic train to Champaign, but it's kind of helpful to your soul to be able to put in a railroad tie and say you did it, and you get to be more expert, and you get to teach others, and so there's this interaction. There has to be an interaction between the small communities like Whiteheath and Hickory Hill and Monticello itself. There has to be people that work with the natural history areas. I'm looking at the time because I have a lot of things here to add. So you see that an interest between the railroads and the nature is very helpful. If we were to take a steam engine down to Shady Rest and perform a chautauqua as you used to, where people would get together and meet in a horse era, how do you take that engine down there? Do you have people walking on the embankment because you can't have things on the side because there's no room on the side? There's this huge embankment. How do you get across a trestle and across a truss bridge? That involves an interaction between the railroaders. And this is not an 80-mile-an-hour line where somebody is going to stand in front of the train and commit suicide. This is 2 miles an hour, and you are talking to the engineer. And I grew up with railroad lines where sometimes the train had to stop and shoo all the sheep off the railroad bed before going. So there is this is not like a 80-mile-an-hour car on a highway. It's like the gentleman backing a semi into a alleyway with 2 inches on one side and 2 inches on the other. He's going to go slow and careful and understand it. So there's this sort of interaction. Okay. The next thing I want to say something about is, let me have a look at my notes here. I want to say something about the USDA crop reserve thing. We've been talking to you about a plot of land in Monticello that has been bought by the Monticello Railroad Museum. It's 21 acres, and it's adjacent to I-72, and part of the acquisition is because it is adjacent to the railroad, and the railroad needs to have some room and space to expand, and there's development all around. So the Railroad Museum's bought additional land, and this 121 acres is in CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. So after the Vital Lands Conference, there was a presentation by people who are aware of all the rules that go with CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. And we have been locally very blessed by this program. The Barnhart Prairie on Vine Street Extended on Yankee Ridge has for years taken advantage of that reserve program. They're on the slope of the Yankee Ridge Moraine, and one of the reasons for the CRPS is that it includes the use of alternate habitat to prevent erosion. If you're on a hill like the site in Monticello, then if you ran your plow furrows up and down the hill, then you're creating a little rivulets that take soil and dump it into the Mississippi and the Gulf. So these reserve programs are often terracing across, putting in mounds of soil that allow the water to be captured so that they'll sink in rather than run off. It's very complicated. You need the backup of attorneys who are prepared to work with this, so farmers can have this sort of access. And about 6% of the agricultural budget is assigned to CRPS. It can be a total CRPS. It's going to be various shades of how we go about it. Is it allowed to be utilized for crop or not crop, or does it have to be in perpetuity? There's a lot of questions. And soil and water conservation people get into this act, and we know that this is an important aspect of life. I have actually been talking to bankers, and they sent me a request for a survey of what we might think the Busey Bank can do better. So I was tempted to say, well, your parking lot to the north of your building is occupied by crows. And why is it occupied by crows? Well, there's no habitat out there. The habitat we have left is urban. And you have a few trees on Park Street. So what do we do? Well, you have agricultural bankers who manage farms. And one of the things that they can do is work with farmers to include some nature, whether it's a strip to control erosion, or whether it's a waterway. You're looking at encouraging this. You also do charitable trusts. Busey is associated with a long family record of the Busey family having a Busey Woods, and there's an Anita Purvis Center there. So if you're contributing trust and to community charitable trust sort of activities, then think about contributing to the Grand Prairie Friends or to the park districts or others who will be doing interesting things locally. And one of the things you can do is that when you have developers putting in business areas, you have an attempt to have trees. So if you want trees quickly, you go to those trees that have big cells and grow quickly. But once they've grown for 50 years, they become old, and their cells get to be weak, and you have a storm, and you lose 30 trees. So if you're thinking about sharing crows around with various trees, and crows are very intelligent creatures, then you encourage the city, and the city is very aware of this, to plant trees like oaks rather than sycamores, so that they will be around for many years. So here I'm also reminding that the bank that we're also in the midst of gentrification with high-rise buildings and apartments everywhere, and bars and whatnot. But in there, people need to do interesting things, and we're in the process of trying to get historic trains into Champaign so that there can be a venue for bicyclists across town, or a meeting in an acre and a half, 2 acres of ground between State Street and Randolph, just north of and west of the post office. How can we get people across town? How can we do that and give people interest in nature nurture that is saved by the railroads? So the railroads are saving our natural area on either side, and they're also educating us about what you have to do to have a railroad and do things. What is the steel that goes into those rails? How do you train people to work with computers so that they can channel trains across the country without accidents and things like that? So now I have down here a note that in here you need academia. So what does the university do about this sort of thing? Well, they have departments of architecture, landscape architecture, planning, and art. And so how can these sorts of groups introduce their students to the area of nature? It's very helpful that these departments are separate from agriculture, whereas in other institutions they're usually with agriculture, and that you have a little competition here between the people who want to study genomes and increase yields in every inch of soil and every inch of economy, and the people who artistically want to preserve some of the dignity of our almost extinct East Central Illinois prairie landscape. So at the Vital Lands conference, there was Chris Cowell. And Chris Cowell has just got a master's degree with landscape architecture, and that requires a project. And in this case, he was working with the land between Monticello and Cisco, which runs right outside Allerton Park, where we hopefully have endangered eastern rattlesnakes that are in the rest of Allerton Park. And so he's had to think about how Allerton Park relates to the railroad. It relates to trails. It relates to bicycles. So how do we get all these different people together? Some people would like to take the railroad out for agriculture. That's a different story again. So then we go back to the Bloomington to Mansfield railroad line, and do we make it yay wide and lose all our nature? So the
2 minutes.
academia can certainly help here and help to train people to be thinking about these things. And some of the younger people who were instrumental in working with the vital lands were getting some of their background information. You don't want to have to work to invent the wheel. The people from 1850s on have been doing that. So you can pick up a lot from that learning. And you can also pick up processes. The whole university is changing to some extent. There are now a lot of rooms in the university, especially a natural history building, which has just been remodeled, so that the lecturer can learn along with the students and have computer access. And that is a more group-friendly thing rather than a monolithic study of one topic. You are having at least some people getting to bring together others and bringing together disciplines. And so it's very hard to do that because it's like trying to paint a picture and putting several names on it. You don't do that. But in actual fact, some of the things like Plato and Mosaic and Netscape and some of the things that are computer things are very much team events, and we would encourage that. I think that's all we can say today. Think about all that and get out there and help the people with nature nurture. Oh, one other thing I had here.
12 seconds, David.
Was a Prairie Moon nursery. You have to, if you're going to do all these things, you have to work with seed. And there was a wonderful gentleman there from Mansfield, and he has a farm, and he's been growing prairie, and he had lots of, David Plunk was his name, and they have lots of interest in so how do you get together other farmers, Beasleys and others in that area to do these sorts of things. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.